A black father, grieving his son's death at the hands of racist cops, decides the justice system isn't enough. He hunts down each officer involved. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon. Beale Street was alive, but not with the usual rhythm of blues and jazz that defined its soul. Tonight, the street thrummed with a different kind of energy, grief, anger, and a quiet resolve that burned hotter than the sweltering July air. Hundreds of people packed the street, candles flickering in shaky hands. Their light carved faint halos in the oppressive darkness, barely keeping the night at bay. The scent of melting wax mingled with the tang of sweat and the lingering smoke of a barbecue cart, abandoned earlier in the evening. A large screen hung at the end of the street, positioned near an old brick building. It displayed the name that had brought them all here: Jamal Jefferson, 18 years old, gone too soon. Marcus Jefferson stood apart from the crowd, his broad shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of the world rested solely on him. In his hands was a framed photo of Jamal, a snapshot from his high school graduation just 2 months ago. In the picture, Jamal's face was bright with a smile so wide it made his eyes crinkle. It was a moment Marcus had been proud of. Now it was a cruel reminder of what had been stolen. He barely registered the murmured prayers, the tearful speeches, or the occasional chants for justice that rippled through the crowd. His attention snapped into sharp focus when a familiar voice crackled over the speakers. "Freeze! Get your hands where I can see them!" The viral video began playing on the screen. Marcus didn't need to watch it. He'd already endured the nightmare more times than he could count. Still, his eyes betrayed him, drawn upward to the grainy footage of his son standing beside his old Toyota Corolla on the side of Highway 61. Jamal's hands were raised, his voice steady as he said, "I'm not resisting, sir." The officer's response was laughter, cruel and hollow, cutting through the speakers like a blade. The next sequence always felt like a blow to the chest. The officer fired without warning, Jamal crumpling to the pavement as if the bullet had torn away the strings holding him upright. There was no gun in Jamal's hands, no threat, only his father's old Marine Corps hoodie. The crowd gasped collectively as the officers on screen laughed again, their voices crackling with static but unmistakable. "That'll teach him to look at me sideways." Marcus's fingers tightened around the frame, his knuckles white. His trembling wasn't grief. It was fury barely contained. He glanced around, the faces in the crowd blurring together. He didn't need their words of comfort or their prayers. He needed action. As the video looped back to its start, Marcus turned on his heel and slipped through the crowd. No one noticed him leave. His movements were deliberate but quiet, purposeful. When he reached the edge of Beale Street, he paused and took one last look over his shoulder. "Jamal," he murmured, his voice low and firm. "They're going to pay." With that, he disappeared into the Memphis night, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness. The night was heavy as Marcus walked away from Beale Street, the distant hum of the vigil fading behind him. Each step felt deliberate, as if his boots carried the weight of his decision with every scrape against the pavement. He didn't need to see the faces of the officers again, hear their laughter, or endure the sterile statements from city officials promising a thorough investigation. He knew how this story ended: suspensions, transfers, and forgotten outrage. No justice. Marcus stopped under a flickering street lamp, its weak light casting his shadow long against the cracked sidewalk. He clutched the photograph of Jamal closer to his chest, the glass frame warm from his grip. In his mind, Jamal's voice echoed, a memory from a conversation they'd had just days before the shooting. "Dad, I just want to make you proud." Jamal had said it while they stood in the driveway, his hands smudged with grease from helping Marcus fix the old Corolla. Marcus had laughed, brushing off the sentiment, but now the words hit him like a gut punch. "Proud doesn't cover it, son," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking in the empty street. "But I failed you." The image of Jamal's body crumpling to the pavement surged to the forefront of his mind. He shook his head violently, as if he could will the memory away, but it clung to him, merciless. Years of discipline as a Marine had taught him control over his emotions, his actions, even his pain. But tonight, all of that training felt like a distant memory. He thought of the oaths he had taken, to serve his country, to protect the innocent, to uphold justice. He had believed in those principles once, so deeply that they had defined him. Now they felt hollow. The justice system wasn't designed for fathers like him or sons like Jamal. It was a machine, cold and indifferent, one he could no longer trust. The officers who took his son's life had been placed on administrative leave, a paid vacation. No charges, no accountability, just more statements, more delays. Standing there, Marcus wrestled with a question that gnawed at his soul. What was the point of principles in a world that abandoned them? He thought of Jamal again, that last smile, the quiet determination in his voice. Something inside Marcus hardened, solidifying like steel forged in fire. "All right, son," he said quietly, his jaw clenched. "If the system won't do right by you, I will." The photograph in his hands felt like a weight he could no longer bear. Marcus slipped it into his jacket and turned toward the night, his steps now driven by a purpose he could no longer ignore. Marcus spent the following days in a haze of relentless focus. His garage, once a space filled with the hum of engines and Jamal's laughter, became his war room. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and sweat as Marcus spread out a map of Memphis on his workbench. Pushpins dotted the city, red for their homes, blue for their favorite haunts, yellow for their routines. He didn't need fancy technology or a team. Years of military training had honed his instincts for surveillance. He knew how to blend into the background, how to watch without being seen. The first officer, Detective Brian Cole, lived in a tidy house on Union Avenue. Marcus learned he frequented a dive bar downtown after his late shifts. The second, Officer Greg Hamlin, had a regular spot at a boxing gym off Poplar Avenue. The third, Sergeant David Lasky, rarely left his suburban enclave except to jog the same route every morning through Shelby Farms Park. They weren't careful. Why would they be? They believed the shield on their chest made them untouchable. Marcus spent hours trailing them, piecing together their lives like a puzzle. He watched Cole stumble out of the bar one night, laughing with friends as if he hadn't stolen a life. He followed Hamlin into the gym, noting the way the officer chatted easily with the staff, a man comfortable in his own skin. Lasky was the hardest to pin down, his routine mundane but disciplined. Still, Marcus saw the cracks, arrogance in the way he carried himself, overconfidence in his predictability. Each moment of observation fanned the flames of Marcus's rage, but it wasn't blind anger driving him. It was precision, purpose. He wasn't just seeking revenge, he wanted accountability. He wanted the world to see these men for what they truly were. Yet late at night, as he sat alone in the garage, the moral weight of his plan pressed on him. Jamal's voice whispered in his mind again, not the proud son this time, but the boy who had once cried over a stray dog hit by a car. "Dad, sometimes people need second chances," Jamal had said then, his young face earnest. The memory cut deep. Marcus shook it off. They had their chance. They squandered it. As he finalized his plans, he felt the tension in his chest, guilt warring with resolve. There was no turning back now. The first officer would pay tonight. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the creak of the rope binding Officer Daniel Crenshaw to the splintered wooden chair. A single naked bulb swung from the ceiling, casting a jittery light across his pale, sweat-slick face. His eyes darted around the room, wild and disbelieving. He'd underestimated Marcus Jefferson, as they all had. Marcus stood in the shadows, a silent sentinel with an aura of terrifying calm. The cabin, deep in the Mississippi Delta, was miles from any neighbor or road. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, a witness to the reckoning unfolding within. "You think this is some kind of joke?" Daniel barked, his voice cracking. He yanked at the ropes, but they didn't budge. His bravado was paper-thin, and Marcus didn't even flinch. The only response was the faint hum of the camera Marcus had positioned in front of Daniel, its red light glowing like an unblinking eye. The hacked live stream was already rolling, broadcasting the scene to thousands, and soon millions, on a hijacked social media feed. Marcus stepped into the light, his face a mask of grim resolve. He dropped a folder onto Daniel's lap. Photos of Jamal spilled out. His bright smile, his high school graduation, his lifeless body sprawled on the pavement. "Tell them what you did," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. Daniel shook his head, defiance flickering. "You're insane. This won't change anything." Marcus leaned in, close enough for Daniel to smell the faint trace of motor oil on his skin. "You're going to tell the truth. Right here. Right now." The silence stretched, suffocating. Then Marcus pulled a battered tablet from his bag and hit play. The audio filled the room, the crack of gunfire, Jamal's muffled voice crying out, the unmistakable laughter of the officers, Daniel's face drained of color. "You don't understand," he stammered. We had no choice." "No choice?" Marcus's voice rose, the edge of controlled fury unmistakable. "You had a choice when you tampered with the body cam footage, when you planted that weapon, when you laughed." Daniel's breath hitched. He looked into the camera, his lips trembling. Fine. I tampered with the footage," he choked out. "We didn't want to deal with the backlash. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Marcus's grip on the tablet tightened, but he forced himself to stay still. The world needed to see this. When the confession was complete, Marcus took a step back, his gaze never leaving Daniel. "This isn't vengeance, Daniel. It's accountability." With a practiced hand, Marcus pulled a blade from his pocket. Daniel whimpered, thrashing against the chair as Marcus moved toward him. The live stream cut to black just as Daniel's scream pierced the air. When it was over, Marcus wiped the blade clean and left Daniel alive but scarred, his badge number carved into his cheek, a permanent reminder of his crimes. Marcus knew he couldn't undo Jamal's death, but he could ensure the truth would never be hidden again. By dawn, the video had gone viral. News stations replayed Daniel's confession on an endless loop, and the country erupted. Some hailed Marcus as a hero, a man driven to act when the system failed. Others condemned him, calling his methods barbaric and dangerous. Protests swelled in cities across the nation, with chants of justice for Jamal echoing in streets from Memphis to New York. Marcus didn't linger to see the fallout. He was already on the move, planning the next step in his mission. There were more officers to face, more truths to uncover. The world could argue over his methods later. For now, he had work to do. The air was tense in the small, dimly lit apartment Marcus now called his base of operations. It belonged to Eddie Parker, an old Marine buddy who owed Marcus his life. Eddie hadn't asked questions when Marcus appeared on his doorstep 2 nights ago, bloodied and silent. He simply nodded and gestured for him to come inside. Now, Eddie sat at the kitchen table, frowning at the news playing on the tiny TV perched on the counter. "They're calling you everything from a terrorist to a freedom fighter," he said, glancing over his shoulder at Marcus. "What do you call yourself?" Marcus didn't look up from the map spread out on the table, marked with pins and scrawled notes. "Doesn't matter what I call myself. It matters what Jamal would think." Eddie leaned back, folding his arms. "And what would he think?" Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the map. "That I'm doing what the system refused to do, holding them accountable." The news anchor's voice rose, cutting through the quiet. "The vigilante known as Marcus Jefferson has struck again, leaving behind another confession, this time from Sergeant Kevin Blake, a senior officer implicated in the cover-up of Jamal Jefferson's death. Blake, found zip-tied to the steps of City Hall, admitted to falsifying reports and obstructing the investigation. Protests have escalated nationwide, with demonstrators demanding systemic reform. Eddie whistled low. "You're not just a ghost to them now. You're a damn legend." Marcus exhaled, his focus shifting to the next name on his list, Detective Sarah Monroe. She'd been the one who sat in the press conference, stone-faced, denying the existence of body cam footage while it rotted in evidence lockers. The footage that, Marcus now knew, could have vindicated Jamal, but Monroe was no rookie. She was sharp, with connections deep in the department. Getting to her would require precision. It wasn't just about forcing a confession, it was about ensuring that her role in the cover-up couldn't be denied. Eddie stood and stretched, moving to the window to peer through the blinds. "Cops are everywhere, they know you're still in Memphis." Marcus smirked grimly. "Good, let them look. They'll keep chasing their tails while I finish what I started." The city was on edge. News stations dissected every move Marcus made. sparking debates that raged across living rooms and social media feeds. Protesters filled the streets, their chants growing louder and their demands more urgent. Police departments in nearby cities were put on high alert, with Memphis PD spearheading a task force dedicated solely to catching him. But Marcus had allies. Old comrades from his Marine days, community members who believed in his cause, even strangers who provided anonymous tips about officers' routines. It was a network born out of shared frustration and pain. As night fell, Marcus prepared to move. Detective Monroe was scheduled to attend a charity gala downtown, an event that would be crawling with off-duty cops and city officials. It was a risk, but Marcus had always thrived under pressure. Eddie handed him a burner phone. "You call if things go sideways. I don't care what it takes. I'll get you out." Marcus nodded, his eyes hard. "I'm not going down, Eddie. Not until they all face the truth." As he slipped into the night, the weight of the city's unrest pressed down on him. But Marcus knew the stakes. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about every name, every face, every story that had been buried under the shield of authority. And he wasn't stopping until the world saw them all. The mansion on Mud Island stood in stark contrast to the neighborhoods Marcus had grown up in. Its tall iron gates, manicured lawns, and stone pillars screamed wealth and privilege, the kind of life that was as foreign to him as it was to most of the city's black residents. But to Marcus, it symbolized something much darker, the power that allowed men like Chief Harold Dixon to silence the voices of those like Jamal. Marcus had spent the better part of the last week setting up for this moment. He knew every inch of Dixon's routine, the late-night gym sessions, the private dinners at upscale restaurants, the meetings with influential figures in the city. He knew that Dixon's arrogance would be his downfall. The chief thought he was untouchable, his position so secure that he never imagined someone like Marcus Jefferson would dare to challenge him. But now, Marcus stood outside Dixon's mansion, watching the house through the shadows, his breath steady. The faint hum of the city was distant, but he could still hear the roar of the protests. He knew that regardless of what happened here tonight, the world was already changing. Whether it was in his favor or not, the conversation had shifted, and the people were waking up. Inside the house, the lights were dim, and the silhouettes of expensive furniture were barely visible through the tall windows. Marcus had tracked Dixon's movements for days, waiting for the perfect moment. He'd learned to blend in, to disappear into the fabric of the city, using its shadows to shield him. He made his move swiftly, entering through a side door left unlocked by a careless security guard. His heart didn't race. His training had long ago beaten any nerves into submission. This was it. The man responsible for so much of the pain Marcus had endured was just a few feet away. He found Dixon in the study, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. The moment the door creaked open, Dixon looked up, his face hardening in recognition. "You," Dixon sneered, standing slowly, his voice laced with disdain. "Oh, you're the one causing all this chaos, aren't you? I should have known." Marcus's hand was steady, his voice cold. "You don't get to talk. Not until you see this." He walked over to the desk, his eyes never leaving Dixon's. With a swift motion, he activated a small portable projector, casting images onto the wall. The room filled with the sound of a child's laughter, Jamal's laughter. The familiar videos of Jamal as a little boy flooded the space. There he was, running through the grass, his eyes full of hope. A birthday party, Jamal blowing out the candles on his cake, his mother smiling beside him. Dixon froze, his face a mask of confusion, and then something darker, guilt maybe, or maybe just the weight of having to watch a young life that could have been, now lost forever. Marcus didn't give him time to process. "You killed him, you and your people. You're not going to walk away from this." Dixon swallowed hard, but remained silent. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow enveloping the chief as he forced him into the chair. His grip tightened around the older man's collar. "Now, tell me why." The chief's lips twitched, a brief moment of panic in his eyes. But then, something in him seemed to break. He slumped forward, his breath ragged as the truth tumbled out. "You want the truth, Jefferson? Fine. Jamal's death was never about one kid. It was about control, about sending a message. We've been running operations for years, culling the black communities, breaking them down, using the threat of violence to keep them in line. The shooting? It was part of a bigger scheme. Jamal was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. We needed someone to die to show them all, to remind them of who holds the power. Marcus's stomach turned as the words settled in. He'd suspected corruption, but this was something else. The system, the one that was supposed to protect people like Jamal, was built on a foundation of fear and oppression. Dixon wasn't just a bad cop. He was a cog in a much larger machine, one that fed on pain and division. "You're lying," Marcus hissed, his voice breaking as rage threatened to consume him. "You're lying to save yourself." Dixon leaned back in his chair, his eyes hardening. "I'm not lying. I don't regret it. You think this is about one kid? You think this is about you? It's bigger than that. This is about keeping order in a world that's out of control." Marcus's fist clenched, his knuckles white. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Dixon's confession hanging heavy in the air. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice low and steady. "I know what you've done. I know what you're a part of. And I'm going to make sure the world knows too." Marcus turned and walked to the door, leaving Dixon alone in his luxurious prison, the confession echoing in the dark silence. The truth was out, and it was going to burn through the walls of the system, no matter how deep they ran. Marcus stepped into the cool night air, his breath slow and deliberate. The weight of the confession, the truth he had extracted, settled heavily in his chest. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the man who orchestrated Jamal's death, the architect of the lies that had broken his heart. But as he stood there, his hand still gripping the doorframe, something inside him shifted. He had promised Jamal that he would be proud of him. The boy's voice echoed in his mind. "Dad, I just want to make you proud, just want to make you—" But Marcus now understood that vengeance, the violent justice he had sought, would not give him the peace he longed for. It would not make Jamal's death any more bearable. It wouldn't bring his son back. As much as the rage burned through him, as much as he wanted to end Dixon's life right then and there, something in his core refused to let him cross that final line. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't the monster Dixon had tried to make him. He was a father, a man who had been wronged, yes, but not one to sacrifice his soul for a moment of vengeance. The plan was clear. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the flash drive, the one that held all the evidence he had carefully collected, the proof of corruption, the manipulation, the cover-ups, and Dixon's damning confession. It was the key to everything, the one thing that could topple the system, the one thing that could spark the change Jamal had deserved to see. He didn't trust many people anymore, but there was one. A reporter named Tasha Cole, who had been investigating police corruption for years. She had reached out to him once, asking questions he hadn't wanted to answer. But tonight, there were no secrets between them. He knew she would run with the story, unrelenting, no matter the danger. She was the kind of person who fought for the truth, no matter the cost. He made the call. Once the conversation was over, Marcus felt the sting of finality. He knew what came next. The authorities were already hunting him, and with the evidence now in the public's hands, there was no escaping the fallout. But he didn't fear it. Not anymore. His purpose had shifted from one of revenge to one of justice. He had exposed the system, and now it was up to the world to reckon with it. In the days that followed, the police force in Memphis crumbled. Officers resigned in disgrace. Others were arrested as the truth poured out into the open. The media frenzy was deafening, the streets filled with protests demanding justice not just for Jamal, but for every person who had been victimized by a system that cared little for their lives. Marcus turned himself in that evening, stepping into the police station with his hands raised. He didn't resist. He didn't hide. He was ready to face whatever came next. His fate was sealed, but as he was led away in handcuffs, there was no regret in his heart. The mural appeared weeks later, on a brick wall along Beale Street, the vibrant colors of Jamal and Marcus's faces staring out at the world. Jamal with his bright smile and eyes full of promise, and Marcus, his expression solemn but proud. The image was more than just a tribute to their lives. It was a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. Even when justice seemed impossible, it was still worth fighting for, and though Marcus's story ended behind prison walls, the change he had ignited in Memphis, the nationwide reckoning he had triggered, was just beginning. Jamal's death would not be forgotten, neither would Marcus's.